the one that created the superhero blockbuster as we know it, one of the most iconic movies of all time, and the movie that really created the superhero genre in movies as we understand it today. Without this movie, we really probably wouldn't have all of the big superhero movies that exist. So Richard Donner's 1978 Superman movie is highly critically acclaimed and loved by fans. It was at the time the most expensive movie of all time and is remembered very fondly even today. I would say that Christopher Reeve's portrayal of Superman is probably still the definitive portrayal of Superman on the silver screen. You guys are welcome to disagree. Let's dive into Superman 1978. So, the version of the movie that I'm going to be looking at, by the way, is the 3-hour version of the movie. It's actually just over 3 hours. This is the extended TV cut. So this is not the one that most people will have seen. And I really wanted to see if I could go back and enjoy this movie once again. Now, when I first saw Superman, I was probably 4 or 5 years old. It's probably the earliest movie that I can remember watching. Christopher Reeve's Superman really was my hero growing up. There wasn't anything else I wanted to do more than donning a red cape and then being Superman. I think that he was kind of my model for a hero and a model for what it was that I wanted to be growing up. And that's why you see me wearing my Superman t-shirt today. So I'm going to start right from the beginning of the movie. So the first thing is that it starts with a little bit about the Depression, interestingly enough, and Metropolis during that time in the 1930s. And it's interesting that that's the way that they decided to open this film. And a nice little nod, I think, to the comics. If I remember correctly, the first Superman comic came out in 1938. That was Action Comics. You've got a very iconic image of Superman lifting up a green car, showing off his strength, of course. So that's the way that this movie begins, with that reference to the 1930s, to the Depression, to Metropolis City. And not long after that, you see the opening credits with Jonathan Williams' absolutely fantastic Superman theme, which it is playing, I think, Superman March, Superman Overture, and you see the credits. And I was wondering while I was watching this how they did the credits. They're kind of this cool effect where they kind of fly onto the screen and then they move off the screen. They go through, of course, the different people that helped make this movie. Of course, the Salkins, I think that's how you would pronounce it. Of course, you've got Richard Donner as well, and you've got the iconic Superman symbol as well, this one that I'm wearing on my chest right now. And the first thing that I thought while I was watching this was how much this reminded me of Star Wars. You know, you've got a Jonathan Williams iconic theme, and then you've got these kind of credits that are, at least in Superman, they're kind of flying onto screen and then flying off. It's actually quite an impressive effect, I think, for a movie that came out in 1978. Now, when the movie opens, the actual movie, as in once we've gotten past the credits, it opens with a fantastic piece of music called The Planet Krypton, by Jonathan Williams, of course, who did the score for this film. And it was also the music that was used in the, I don't know if it was the theatrical trailer, I think it might have been the teaser trailer for Superman Returns. And I'll be referring to Superman Returns a little bit because Superman Returns is actually kind of a sequel to this film. It's considered sort of a part of the same film series. I believe that Brandon Routh's Superman is actually meant to be the same Superman played by Christopher Reeves in this movie and in Superman 2. But Planet Krypton, fantastic piece of music, really great. And the movie opens on, of course, the planet Krypton. And you can tell, even though this is an old movie, you can see that they spent a lot of money on the effects for this, for Krypton. They show the entire planet, and it opens with the trial of Zod and his two minions, so you got Ursa, and I think is it Nom? And they're being sentenced for insurrection and a few other things. and eventually they are sentenced to be imprisoned in the Phantom Zone, which it's mentioned in the opening of this movie that was a place that was found actually by Jor-El, who's played by Marlon Brando, who at the time was maybe considered the greatest actor of that generation. So very interesting, this movie. It was, the original script was written by Mario Puzo, though of course I don't know how much of that actually made it into this movie, because it was worked on by a few other people as well. And you've also got the Godfather himself, Don Corleone. You've got Marlon Brando playing Jor-El, Superman's father. And just something to note, which is that Jor-El in this movie is a scientist, and depending on what kind of Superman media you're consuming, whether it's the cartoons or one of the TV shows or one of the movies or the comics, and which era you're in, he's going to be something like a politician or a scientist or something else. But in this case, he's a scientist. And so Zod and Ursa and Nom are all sent to the Phantom Zone. And then sort of immediately after that, Jor-El himself is sort of, being, he's sort of being put on trial by the Kryptonian Council himself. And, Jor-El is saying that, hey, this planet's going to explode within 30 days. And he's accused of trying to incite an insurrection himself with all of these claims, and of course he's ignored, he's belittled, his ideas are completely dismissed. And so Jor-El and his wife Lara decide that the best thing to do is to, of course, put their infant son in a spaceship and then send him to Earth. And there's a point where Jor-El is having a conversation with Lara, and Lara asks, why have you chosen Earth? And Jor-El goes for a few reasons, saying, of course, that something like the density of his molecules or something will make him strong and fast and all the rest of it. And Lara mentions that he's going to be odd, he's going to be strange, he's going to be different. And Jor-El says that, that their son is going to be something for humanity to sort of strive towards. I forget the exact wording, but he mentions that, yes, he will be different. So a lot of Marlon Brando's lines in this movie were also mentioned in Superman Returns, and I remember them near enough word for word from that movie. And Jor-El makes this speech, which is very, very similar to actually a couple of lines from the Bible. And I'd like to make a separate movie really about the allusions to Superman as a god, as a Christ figure, and all the other kind of themes and things which people might have missed in this film. I just want to keep this one strictly just about me reviewing the film. But there's a line about the son becomes the father, and the father becomes the son, and everything that I know, my son, I bequeath to you. And just in the previous scene, when Zod is being sentenced by the Kryptonian Council, he says to Jor-El, you will bow before me, as will your ears, right before they're kind of sent away in this kind of mirror of the that represents the Phantom Zone. And at the end of the scene where Jor-El makes this speech to his infant son, of course, he's sent up in this Kryptonian vessel, which really looks a bit like kind of a star. It's kind of like a spiky white thing that breaks the Kryptonian kind of dome on the planet Krypton, and then escapes the planet right as it's falling apart. It's kind of very red, and it's essentially like a huge earthquake. And the Kryptonians, of course, are they're not going to survive this. And of course, Superman, or he's not Superman just yet, but Kal-El, their son, is going to make it. He's going to make it to Earth. So it's very interesting that in the journey from Krypton to Earth, Jor-El seems to be sort of teaching his son about Earth and about history, and says, although you have been raised as as a human being, you will never be one of them. And as the Kryptonian vessel is passing, it actually comes across this mirror that contains Zod and Ursa and Nom, and they're kind of screaming for help. But of course, he's just a baby in a Kryptonian ship and is on its way to Earth. So this sets up the second movie, of course, when those three are going to be the main antagonists of that film. So in most Superman media, Superman doesn't develop his power until his teen years. So once he starts sort of going through puberty, of course, he starts getting his powers and he starts realizing that he's a little bit different. In this movie, they didn't do that. Pretty much as soon as John and Martha Kent discover Superman, or Kal-El in his little spaceship, he's lifting up the back of the truck, so he's already quite strong. That's an absolutely terrifying idea of like an infant child who has these incredible powers, including all of this strength, lifting up a truck. That would absolutely scare the hell out of me. But yeah, they don't dwell on that too much. So they end up taking in the child, and interesting enough, although the movie is quite long, it seems to kind of move at a fast clip. Krypton's been destroyed, and then he's discovered by Jonathan and Martha Kent, and then he's of course adopted, and then we jump to Superman, or Kal-El I should say, at high school in Smallville, and he seems to be sort of bullied a little bit. He doesn't seem to be particularly high up the food chain on the social scene there, and there's a brief moment with him and Lana Lang, and there's a bit where he outruns the kind of the jocks of the school by running into town from school. While they're in the car, and they're sort of like, well, hey, Clark, how did you manage to make it here? And what's very interesting, I didn't notice this in the movie, but as Clark is walking up to, I think, the Kent farm, he's limping a bit. And I did take a look on into this, and it turns out that apparently the actor who did that, who played young Clark, ended up hurting himself while doing the scene where Clark is outrunning a train. And because this is the extended cut of this movie, there's a scene where there's a young Lois Lane with her parents on a train, and she looks out the window and says, hey, look, there's a guy out there racing the train. And of course they don't believe her. And what's interesting is that the people who play her parents actually played Clark Kent and Superman and Lois Lane. I think in the first ever Superman movie, which was a black and white movie, back in the day, I don't know which one. One of the things that Clark is told by Jonathan Kent is that you're here for a reason. Whatever that is, it's not here to score touchdowns, because of course Clark, while he was at the Smallville school, he ends up kicking the football, and it goes, of course, flying, because he's Superman, and of course he's faster and he's stronger. And so you hear the young Clark wanting to use his powers to look good and to get on the football team, and Pa Kent reminds him, you're not here to score touchdowns. You're here for a reason, and it's not to do that. And it doesn't take particularly long after that Jonathan Kent ends up suffering from his heart attack. And I've mentioned this in another movie, in another video, which has not been uploaded. But this is one of the most important lessons that Superman has to learn, that Clark Kent has to learn, which is that even despite all of his powers, he can't save everyone. Despite essentially being a god on Earth, he can't save everyone. And he says this quite explicitly in the funeral scene. He says, all of those powers, all of those things that I can do, and I couldn't even save him. It's quite it's quite an emotional moment for Clark and an important part of him as Superman. And interesting that the last lesson that he learns from Jonathan Kent is about sort of hiding his powers, is about maintaining humility, and pursuing a higher path, and not pursuing sort of self-interest. And that's of course one of the things that makes Superman who he is. So I don't know if it's actually meant to be that night, but it seems to be that night after Jonathan Kent's funeral that Clark ends up hearing a whirring sound coming from the barn where he finds a green Kryptonian crystal, and then he decides to take that crystal. And the next day he ends up having a conversation with his mother and says, "I have to go." And she acknowledges that this day was going to come, that he's going to have to leave. He's going to have to leave the Kent farm and go become his own man. So he leaves, and I don't know why he ends up in the Arctic, but of course he does. And once he gets there, he ends up taking out the green Kryptonian crystal, and I have no idea how he would have even known that this is what he's supposed to do. He throws it, of course, into some water, and this creates the Fortress of Solitude. And the interesting thing is, if you go to the Wikipedia page for the Fortress of Solitude, it's actually an image from 2007 Action Comics, and it's essentially the same. It's the same Fortress of Solitude that you find in this 1978 movie. And as I said, this is the extended 3-hour cut of this film. You don't see Christopher Reeve as Superman or in the suit until a full hour into this movie. It's very long, so I had to watch this in about 2 or 3 sittings because I couldn't sit down and watch it all at once. But of course, once he gets to the Fortress of Solitude, he learns more about his Kryptonian heritage. He learns about who Jor-El is, who he is, where he came from. And it's a good scene in that, one of the things that happens is that this is where Superman begins learning from his second father, perhaps his first father, depending on how you look at it. Once Jonathan Kent is gone, he's now learning what it means to be a hero, what it means to be a good man from Jor-El. And there's a particular line that says something like, what does it mean to be a good man? What does it mean to be virtuous? And when should the well-being of others exceed the importance of your own well-being? And he says, these are not easy questions. And so one of the interesting things about Superman is that the reason he is Superman is because of his principles, because of his values, because of who he is, because of the things that he learned from his Kryptonian father, and of course his earthly father in Jonathan Kent as well. So after seeing Christopher Reeve as Superman for the first time flying out of the Fortress of Solitude, at the end of this scene, we then jump straight to Metropolis. Now, Metropolis in this movie is New York. It's literally New York. You can see the Twin Towers. You see the yellow cabs. There's even a little bit of Grand Central Station as well. Later on in the movie, you're going to see the Statue of Liberty. But Metropolis is basically, it's New York, pretty much. And so the scene opens at the Daily Planet. We're introduced to Jimmy Olsen. We're introduced to Lois Lane and Perry. And Lois being the sort of hard-nosed, very independent reporter at the Daily Planet, and Jimmy as the kind of young, enthusiastic photographer, and Perry, of course, as the sort of complaining boss of the two of them. Christopher Reeves does a great job as the mild-mannered, sort of bumbling, socially awkward Clark Kent. It's very interesting for a guy as big as he is. I think he was over 200 pounds at this point when the movie was being filmed, and he's 6'4", but he's quite socially awkward, keeps bumping into things, of course. And then there's the scene with the mugger. And just leading up to this, I should mention that, Clark Kent is quite the gentleman. He offers to take Lois's coat, and when the mugger does show up, Clark sort of like, pushes Lois to one side and then steps in between her and the mugger. And of course, this is the sort of first scene where we see him doing something as Clark Kent, helping somebody else, doing something that is not really within his own interests, using his powers while at the same time hiding them. So he catches the bullet when Lois decides to try and be a hero herself, and then tries to kick this mugger after dropping her bag on the floor. Anyway, yeah, it was just quite a cool thing. Just a reminder that Superman's really he's a Boy Scout. He's also a gentleman as well. This is also about the time that we're introduced to Lex and his two minions, Otis and Ava. There's kind of a fairly long and boring foot chase, to be very honest with you, in this movie, as Otis is trying to get away from a couple of cops and then ends up in Lex's underground lair with Ava. And I don't know, there was a moment where Lex was asking if Otis had fed the babies, and I'm like, who are the babies? And I'm not quite sure what they are, but I was like, what is that? Is that like Cerberus or something? Does he have tigers down the lift shaft? What even are those? And I don't know. Lex has some sort of large animals that need to be fed an entire cow at the bottom of this, what looks like a lift shaft. There's also a bunch of black and white images on Lex's desk. I don't know. One of them looked like Mussolini, Benito Mussolini. The other one I couldn't quite tell. There's a few other smaller pictures, but I don't really know who they are. But yeah, we're introduced to Ava, and we're introduced to Otis in this as well. One of the interesting things about this is that this is a movie made, of course, in the late 70s, and Lois is this very, very independent woman. She says something like, hey, I've seen how the other side lives, my sister. She's got 3 kids, 2 cats, and a mortgage. She's like, ugh, she's not like her sister, in short. So that evening, at this point in the movie, Lois Lane is going to go and, I think, try and interview the president. She wants to go to see Air Force One, which is going to land at Metropolis Airport. And then, of course, this is the sort of iconic helicopter scene where something goes wrong with the helicopter, and I think the pilot ends up getting knocked out. And, of course, Lois Lane looks like she's about to fall out of this helicopter. It's incredible how everyone suddenly develops really great upper body strength when they're hanging on to something in a movie. And they can hold on for like a couple of minutes at a time. I can tell you, it's pretty difficult to hold on to a pull-up bar for about 2 minutes with just your own body weight. But hey, it's a movie. And then, of course, the Superman theme starts up, and then Superman shows up. And so Metropolis is seeing him for the first time. And there's that moment where Superman catches Lois as she's falling, and he says, yeah, don't worry, ma'am, I've got you. And she says, got me? Who's got you? And that night he just ends up doing a whole bunch of heroic stuff, because of course he's Superman. So this is his reveal to the world as Superman. He saves Lois and the helicopter pilot, and the helicopter, he stops it falling on a whole bunch of people. He ends up stopping a jewel thief who's going up the side of a building. He ends up stopping a bunch of robbers who end up on a boat, and he catches them while they're counting their money. And of course, there's a thunderstorm that ends up taking out one of the engines on Air Force One. So Superman ends up, holding up the side of the plane where the engine's gone out. And so, the Superman theme is playing, and this is really him showing the world who he is for the first time. And there's a bit of humor in this scene. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. I did like it. There's a very jarring cut, by the way. All of a sudden, once he's done all of this, he ends up in the Fortress of Solitude, and he's talking to his dad, Jor-El. And it's very interesting because Jor-El kind of says to him, like, you enjoyed it, didn't you? and of course Superman admits that he did. So I like that, there's a bit of humanity there. Jor-El says, don't be too harsh with yourself on your vanity, but just be sort of aware of it. He's getting his guidance from his dad on what kind of hero he should be. But I like these little moments in Superman movies where they show that he does have certain human characteristics. Being proud or vanity, all of these things are very human emotions, and you can see Christopher Reeves does a great job of showing that he's enjoying being Superman. He's enjoying catching these criminals and dropping them off to the cops and then saving lives, holding up the airplane and the helicopter, and it's all a lot of good fun. It's at this moment that Jor-El says to Kal-El, he says, at this moment I could embrace you, my son, which is to say that he's proud of Kal-El. He's proud of what he's become and what he's doing, and the values and principles that he's demonstrating in spending this night going around saving people and catching criminals. So of course, at some point we switch to the Daily Planet, and Perry is yelling at all of his reporters saying, hey, somebody needs to get an interview with this guy. Who is he? Tell us everything about him. Where did he get his suit from? What football team or baseball team does he support? And it's very interesting. There's a moment where Perry says, whoever gets this interview, this is going to be the most important interview since God spoke to Moses. And this is just another one of the sort of various sort of biblical references, or references to Superman as a kind of biblical or godlike or prophet-like figure. So of course it has to be Lois Lane who ends up getting the scoop on Superman, and this is the scene that leads to her writing the story. I think it's called something like My Night with Superman, where she ends up meeting him on a rooftop. She lives in a very nice apartment, by the way, in New York. Metropolis. I wonder how much an apartment like that would have cost in at that time in the 1970s. But Superman ends up showing up, and it's very obvious, of course, the way Margot Kidder is acting and Christopher Reeves as Superman, that she absolutely has the hots for him. It's interesting that she asks him his height and his weight. He says 6'4". I think Christopher Reeve actually was 6'4" at that time, and he mentions his weight as 225 pounds, which is about 100-ish kilos. If you're in the UK, I don't think he was quite that big. Christopher Reeve, I think, was closer to about 218 pounds. I think I might need to double check that. But the entire scene is very sort of. It's very good at showing them sort of flirting and getting to know each other, and her learning what she can about this strange individual from another world that is, of course, going around saving people and catching robbers and the rest of it. So it's a pretty cool little scene. They also have the bit, and I don't know if this was actually in the theatrical cut of the movie, where there's a song. So Superman ends up taking Lois out for a flight over Metropolis, and there's in the movie, at least the one that I saw, she's just reading the lines, but there was actually a song that's released, and it's it's kind of cheesy, but it's also quite sweet at the same time. There's a moment she says, "Here I am like a little kid, holding hands with a god." That's pretty explicit there. That Superman is, he's pretty much a god when you add up all of his powers together. And then this takes us to the final sort of stretch of the movie, which is Lex Luthor's diabolical plan to try and, create a whole bunch of very valuable real estate from himself by hitting the San Andreas fault with a nuclear weapon, which would sink the whole of the West Coast, and then the land that would be left would be Lex's, because he's already bought that up. So one thing that I noticed about this movie is that Lex mentions that the way that he gets Superman's attention is by mentioning a lithium propane bomb. And as far as I know, there's no such thing as a lithium propane bomb. I don't think that's a thing that exists. And he also mentions that he's going to hit the San Andreas Fault with a 500 megaton nuclear weapon. Now, one thing to know about this is that I think it shows that audiences today are just a little bit more scientifically aware. Um, you know, there's no such thing as a 500 megaton nuclear weapon. That's about 10 times the power of the most powerful nuclear weapon that was ever exploded, which was exploded in the Soviet Union, which was the Tsar bomber. I think the most powerful one in the US was it Castle Bravo, I think, which was at like 16 or 17 megatons. And I guess maybe in the 1970s, even at the height of the Cold War, and this is very much a Cold War movie, that's why you have nuclear weapons in it. Even at the height of the Cold War, it seems like audiences probably wouldn't have picked up on this. I wouldn't have picked up on it as a kid, but knowing a little bit more about things like nuclear weapons and just generally being a bit more scientifically minded, I think, as audiences tend to be today, I picked up on that. One thing I have to say about this movie, unfortunately, is that the effects don't really hold up all that well. I know the movie came out in the 1970s, and it was at the time the most expensive movie ever made. But it really doesn't look all that good today, and I think that kind of makes sense because that was a long time ago now. This movie is nearly half a century old, so when you compare it to anything that's been made over the past sort of 15, 20 years, it's just not going to look very good. So apparently a lot of the effects in this for showing Superman flying are front projection. I don't know if they used rear projection in some cases as well, but it looks very, very janky. Very janky. It does not look smooth at all. I think there are a few effects that I looked at and I'm thinking, hey, that looks pretty cool. I wonder how they managed to make that look good. I think particularly when you see Superman sort of flying up in the air, when they're sort of looking up at him, as opposed to the shots where you are up in the air with him, which don't look so good. But it's a bit jerky. It's not very smooth. The background's a bit blurry, and of course you can see that it's sort of out of place. And the tagline for this movie was "You'll believe that a man can fly," and I'm sure it looked absolutely fantastic back then, and I wouldn't have been able to tell that it was a bit off back when I was 4 or 5, 6 years old. But watching it now, of course, as an adult and seeing the newer Superman movies, you can definitely see that it does look a little bit janky. I think there's the scene where Superman is flying after one of the nuclear missiles. I think this is the one that's going to head to Jersey, Hackensack, Jersey, and Superman is flying after this nuclear weapon. And nuclear weapons, of course, they I think they fly at ICBMs fly at hypersonic speeds. Though, I mean, that shouldn't really be too much of a problem for Superman, unless you're trying to create drama in a movie. And there's a scene where he's flying through a canyon, and you can see it in the background. And yeah, it doesn't look particularly good. And I guess there's a bit of a reference to that in 2013's Man of Steel, which is where you see Superman, Henry Cavill, flying through the Grand Canyon. And if this scene did anything, watching it again, seeing Christopher Reeve flying after this nuclear missile, it really made me appreciate that scene in Man of Steel where he's flying for the first time all the more. And I think that's probably the best scene in Man of Steel, is actually seeing Superman fly for the first time. My favorite scene, certainly. Which brings me on to one of the things with Superman. This is something that Superman has suffered over the decades for as long as he's been around, which is that sort of like, how powerful is he? Where do you place his powers? How fast or strong or what have you do you want him to be? The effects, as I said in this, are pretty cool. So the where they're showing the San Andreas Fault, and then they're showing the nuke hit, and then there's kind of, you see the fault sort of falling inwards. That looked pretty good. And there's a scene a little bit later where they show Superman kind of lifting the fault back up so that it's no longer crumbling. But when Lois ends up dying, which of course she does, because that's what happens in this film. There's 2 nuclear weapons. One goes to Jersey. Superman ends up stopping the one going to Jersey because he promised Ava that he would do that to save her mother, and he doesn't have enough time to stop the second one. And of course, Superman gets very angry, very upset, and the look on Christopher Reeve's face when he finds Lois and she's already dead, and he ends up flying. He's very angry, and he ends up, of course, flying fast enough that he ends up turning back time. And there's a problem with time travel in movies and stories in general. You kind of need to put a cap on it, because you don't really, once you say, hey, we can turn back time and we can now we can just change we can change the past by going back and changing it, then you can just keep doing that. It's the same problem that you find in stories where it's like, hey, we can bring this person back to life. It essentially cheapens when a character ends up passing. But anyway, so Superman ends up hearing the voice of both his dads. Jor-El saying it is forbidden to interfere in human history. This is like the third time that he's heard Jor-El say this, and of course he hears Jonathan Kent of Kate, of course, saying, "You're here for a reason," and Clark also remembers, all of those powers, and I couldn't even save him. And he decides that, well, I'm not going to let this stand. I'm going to fly fast enough to turn back time so that he can stop both the missiles and save Lois and, save a bunch of people with this dam. There's a sort of a weird sub-story with a bunch of American Indians and him giving their water back, after the dam has been destroyed. It's one of those things where Superman is kind of trying to do too much, but by turning back time, he can get Lex, and he can save Ava from Lex, and he can get Otis as well. And the final scene is, of course, Superman delivering Lex and Otis to the prison. I guess Ava got away scot-free, but that's because she ended up saving Superman by taking the Kryptonian the kryptonite necklace sort of off Superman when Lex was using it against him. And you have this kind of quite cheesy line from the head of the prison, who says, the country is safe again thanks to you, Superman. And you see Gene Hackman take off his wig as Lex Luthor for the first time, and I don't know if that was a something that put on his head, or if he actually shaved his head. I don't know, because Lex Luthor is meant to be bald, but for most of this movie you don't see him until right at the end that he's bald. But the effect of Chris Reeve, sort of taking off from the prison and flying away is pretty cool. I think the final shot of Superman flying around the globe as the sun rises was really cool. I've certainly seen that shot before. I think in Superman Returns and also in Man of Steel. I'm pretty sure that the makers of those two movies looked at that scene and said, hey, I wonder if I can make that scene again, because it's really cool, but do it with modern digital effects. So that was a great ending to the movie, I think. And of course it's got that Superman theme by John Williams. Really, really iconic. I love that theme. I do listen to it sometimes when I'm walking around. It's on my playlist. And then finally we have the end credits. Of course, you've got the Superman theme, and then you've got the credits rolling up. And once again, of course, it all reminds me of Star Wars. If you remember, at the end of the original trilogy, you've got the Star Wars theme, and then you've got the credits rolling up as well. So yeah, a nice happy end to the movie. Lois and Jimmy and everyone else ends up surviving, and of course Superman ends up stopping the nuclear weapons as well. So just as a kind of a final sum up of the movie, as my review, the effects do not look very good. I'm gonna have to be very honest with you, particularly the flying effects. They may have looked good back in 1978, but they don't look so good now. Certain effects look pretty good, I think, when Superman Clark ended up kicking the football up into the air. I would say the effect of looking up at Superman rather than being up there with him and seeing him flying around looks really good. The credits look really good as well. As for the story, the story's kind of fine. I don't know if it's just because this is the 3 hour version of the movie, but it is a slog. I would suggest that you don't try to watch this all at once. Try and watch it in 2 sittings. I watched it in 3, just because it was difficult for me to be able to sit down for 3 hours of this and to watch the whole thing. It's very interesting seeing the particular characterizations of Clark and Superman and Lois and Perry and Jimmy and Lex in this. Clark is sort of, he's literally called mild-mannered Clark Kent. He's very socially awkward, bit bumbling, bumps into things, very kind of shy, though he does manage to ask out Lois, so props to him. Lois, very hard-headed, very independent, though of course once she comes into contact with Superman, she's absolutely smitten with him, without a doubt. Perry is Perry, he's yelling at everyone and telling them to get the story and telling them to make good stories. Interesting here that Lex in this case he's basically a genius criminal mastermind. It's not entirely clear how he managed to make his money. They mention real estate, but it's not strictly clear. And this is different to the later characterizations of Lex as the scion of a billionaire family. He inherits he inherits LexCorp, I think, from his father. I don't know that he builds it later on in the comics and the movies, but yeah, a very different kind of Lex in this too. So what did you guys think about this movie? I don't know if you've seen it anytime recently. How many times have you seen it? What did you think of the different characterizations of the characters in this? How do you feel about the effects? Perhaps you disagree and you think that I'm being just a little bit too harsh on the effects, and maybe that the story. There are moments sometimes in movies where I'm like, I'm a little bit bored at the moment, and I did kind of get that in this movie. Shoot me, I loved it as a kid, but I did find that there were times where it was a little bit dull. But what did you guys think? Did you enjoy this movie? Do you think I'm too harsh? Do you think that I'm not giving the credit that it deserves? Or do you think that actually it doesn't hold up at all today? Leave a comment, let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next video. Do take care of yourself, guys. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this video.